You know, and so, and when, well, what, and when, well, what, and when, well, what, and when, well, what. This devolution of the American press began in 1988 when Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine. We had a rule in this country that was passed in 1928 at the dawn of commercial radio called the Fairness Doctrine. And that rule said that the airwaves belong to the public. The broadcasters can be licensed to use them, but only with the proviso that they use them to promote the public interest and to advance American democracy. There were 3 requirements under the Fairness Doctrine. Number 1, they had to air issues of public import. That's why there's a 6 o'clock news hour on the networks. Not because they wanted it, they wanted to put entertainment in that slot. The news departments traditionally were money losers. So they were forced to do that as part of the Fairness Doctrine. That's why the radio stations periodically update you on the news. It's part of the requirement under the original Fairness Doctrine that they're still doing as a tradition. On number 2, if they were going to give opinion, they had to tell both sides. Number 3, they had to avoid corporate consolidation. Congress wanted to make sure that people in Kansas could get crop reports, that people in North Dakota could get tornado warnings, that people in the South could get country music, that you wouldn't have programming and content dictated by a couple of corporate epicenters in remote areas of the country. And that part of the Fairness Doctrine, incidentally, was strengthened in 1945, was fortified, because Congress saw what Hitler had done in Europe and the other fascist governments had done, where they had allowed these corporate consolidations and they had given these contracts and special favors to the media, and they had co-opted the media and got them on their side so that anybody who criticized them was either muzzled or was branded as unpatriotic. And they said, we can't allow that to happen in this country. So they strengthened that part of the Fairness Doctrine. Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine as a favor to the Christian right, which was already plotting the takeover of AM radio, and as a favor to the studio heads who had helped him get elected, who were plotting the takeover of all media. And today, as a result of that, there are 5 giant multinational corporations who control virtually all 14,000 radio stations in America, all 5,000 television stations, 80% of our newspapers, all of our billboards, and most of the large internet content providers. So there are 5 guys who are deciding what we hear as news and information. And the news departments have become corporate profit centers. They no longer have an obligation to promote the public interest. Their only obligation is to their shareholders. And they serve that obligation not by telling us the difficult issues that we need to understand, like what happens when you privatize Social Security, and how did the pharmaceutical companies end up controlling Medicaid and Medicare, what is global warming, and all of these issues, but rather by cutting costs. And guess what? Where do they cut costs? They cut costs by firing all of their investigative reporters. 80% of investigative reporters have lost their jobs over the past 15 years. The people who could connect the dots between the money that came from the corporate polluters to the White House, and the rollbacks that were engineered by the White House, and the children that you see, the asthmatic kids that you see in New York City and all over this country. Nobody's making those connections. Nobody's connecting the dots. So you see the asthmatic kid, and you're not saying the White House has something to do with that. The fact that in 19 states you can no longer safely eat any freshwater fish caught in the state because of mercury contamination coming from coal-burning power plants that were supposed to have removed 90% of that mercury 5 years ago, but the White House, having accepted $48 million from that industry, rolled back those rules so that now there's 19 states, all of the freshwater fish are unsafe to eat, and in 49 states, most or some of the freshwater fish, including New York, which most of them are unsafe to eat. The only state where all the freshwater fish are safe to eat is Wyoming, where the Republican-controlled legislature has refused to appropriate the money to test the fish. But in all the other states, some or most or all of them are unsafe to eat. According to CDC, 1 out of every 6 American women now has so much mercury in her womb, 1 out of every 6, that her children are at risk for a grim inventory of diseases: autism, blindness, mental retardation, heart, liver, and kidney disease. All of this could have been stopped, except that Bush abolished the mercury rule. But the Americans don't know that. The reason they don't make the connection is because there's no investigative reporters out there telling them about that connection. They also got rid of all the foreign news bureaus. When I was a kid, ABC had 47 foreign news bureaus in Europe. Now it has none. It buys its news in a can from the European producers. And that's why the only way that you can get foreign news in this country is if you go to BBC. Americans, we're supposed to be the leader of the free world, of the entire world. And yet we have no idea what's happening in other cultures or other countries. And that's why the American people, were able to be gulled into this neocon fantasy that we were going to be met by flowers and rose petals in the streets when we went into Iraq. And because they have no obligation to promote the public interest, their only obligation is to their shareholders. They serve that obligation not by explaining the difficult issues that we need to understand to make rational decisions in a democracy, but rather by entertaining us, by appealing to the lowest common denominator, the prurient interest that all of us have in the reptilian core of our brains for sex and celebrity gossip. American people are today the best entertained and the least informed people on the face of the earth. That has profound implications for our democracy, because a democracy cannot function long without an informed public. It is so critical to have a working press in our country. And I went back and looked at the debates that occurred when the Fairness Doctrine was passed almost unanimously by Republicans and Democrats in 1928, and that they recalled the initial debates at the beginning of our country, where there was a division between Jefferson, who wanted a universal franchise, he wanted everybody to vote, and Hamilton, Adams, and Madison, who wanted to restrict the vote to landed gentry. They believed that the great mass of uninformed, uneducated public would not be forthright in fighting to retain their civil rights that these guys had laid down their lives and their fortunes for. And they said, only an educated public who has a long view will do that. And Jefferson agreed, and Jefferson himself said, an uninformed public will trade 100 years of hard-fought civil rights for a half an hour of welfare to the first religious fanatic or demagogue or tyrant who comes along and promises them a $300 tax break. He didn't say that, the last part, but he said the first part. But that's what he was talking about. And he said the remedy for that is not to deprive the public of their rights, but rather to forcibly inform them, whether they want to be informed or not. And that's why the 13 colonies did something that nobody had done in history, which was to impose mandatory public education. So you would go to jail if you did not attend school. You were punished for it. Jefferson in Virginia started all these educational institutes, University of Virginia and other ones, to force people to understand current events and to understand philosophy and history and all these other things that we need to understand if we're going to retain our democracy. And the Fairness Doctrine came along. Everybody said, hey, this is going to be the way that the public gets its information. We cannot afford to let this medium fall into the hands of a handful of profit-making corporations who are going to use it to enhance their own position and consolidate their power with government against the people and against our constitutional rights. And that's why they passed the Fairness Doctrine. It was eroded. It was destroyed by Reagan, and then Clinton also, through their telecommunications, torpedoed it and sank it completely. So corporate consolidation is happening now as we are seeing the privatization of the American government. And we have a government that turned FEMA over to somebody who paid them campaign contributions. And the head of the Forest Service is a timber industry lobbyist. The head of public lands, a mining industry lobbyist, Stephen Griles, who believes that public lands are unconstitutional. The head of the Air Division at the EPA is a utility lobbyist, Jeffrey Homestead, who's represented nothing but the worst air polluters during his entire career. The head of Superfund is a woman whose last job was teaching corporate polluters how to evade Superfund. The second in command of EPA is a Monsanto lobbyist. The top 100 environmental officials in the Department of Commerce, which regulates fisheries, Department of Interior, Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture, at the FDA, the EPA, and even the relevant divisions of the Justice Department are virtually, without exception, lobbyists from the worst of the worst of the worst of these polluters. And this is happening throughout our government, not just in the pollution, but everywhere else, where you're getting corporations who are now running American government. And what happens when you allow corporations to run our government? What you get is plunder. The American people have to understand that there is a huge difference between free market capitalism, which is a good thing because it makes us more efficient, more prosperous, and more democratic, and the kind of corporate crony capitalism, which has been embraced by this White House. The reason they shouldn't be running our government is because corporations don't want the same thing for America as Americans want. Corporations do not want free markets, and they do not want democracy. They want profits. And the best way for them to get profits too often is to use our campaign finance system, which is just a system of legalized bribery to get their hooks into a public official, then use that public official to dismantle the marketplace, to give them monopoly control, and then to privatize the commons, to turn over our treasury, our air, our water, our public lands, our wildlife, our fisheries, the shared resource of our society that give context to our communities, that connect us to our past, and that are a source of our values and our virtues and our character as a people, and to turn those over for profit to these corporations. And corporations legally cannot do good things. They cannot do true philanthropy. They can't do things that are good for our country or for our communities. When you see Walmart bringing bottled water down to the Katrina victims, they're not doing that to be good guys. They're doing it because they think that over the long run, that the public view of them will be enhanced, and that will enhance their shareholder value and their dividend distribution. If they have another reason for doing it, any one of their shareholders can sue them, and they will win that lawsuit. It is called wasting corporate assets. It is against the law in this country for a corporation to turn itself into a philanthropy. And if they're caught doing it, their board members will be punished. Their shareholders can sue them. And we want corporations to be this way, to focus narrowly. We don't want them to turn into philanthropies, because nobody would invest in them. We want them to focus narrowly on shareholder value. But we would be nuts to let them anywhere near our government, because we designed them to plunder. And that's what they're going to do to us if we let them run our country. And that's what they're doing now. And that's why, from the beginning of our national history, our greatest political leaders, Republicans and Democrats, have been warning Americans against the domination of corporate power. Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, said that America would never be destroyed by a foreign enemy, by an Osama bin Laden, but he warned that our Bill of Rights, our Constitution, and our treasured democratic institutions would be subverted by malefactors of great wealth who would steal them from within. Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, in his most famous speech ever, warned Americans against the domination by the military-industrial complex. Abraham Lincoln, the greatest Republican in history, said during the height of the Civil War in 1863, "I have the South in front of me, and I have the bankers behind me. And for my country, I fear the bankers more." And Franklin Roosevelt, during World War II, said that the domination of government by corporate power is, quote, the essence of fascism. And Benito Mussolini, who had an insider's view of that process, said essentially the same thing. He complained that fascism should not be called fascism. It should be called corporatism, because it was the merger of state and corporate power. And what we have to understand in this country is that the domination of business by government is called communism, and the domination of government by business is called fascism. And what we need to do, what our job is to walk that narrow trail in between, which is free market capitalism and democracy, and hold big government at bay with our right hand and big business at bay with our left. And in order to do that, we need an informed public that is able to recognize all the milestones of tyranny. And we need an aggressive and independent press that is willing to stand up and speak truth to power. And we no longer have that in the United States of America.